My talk is called Varnish in Action, and I'd like to introduce myself first. I am Thijs, and I'm an evangelist at Combel, a hosting company, as mentioned, and I'm also in PHP Benelux. Now, just for marketing purposes, who knows PHP Benelux? Raise your hands, please. Who was at our conference? Thank you, thank you. So we're the user group that covers Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, basically. But I'm from Belgium, and everyone knows that country. Nowadays, it's quite popular in the news. We actually broke some records. This record, so. And in Belgium, I live in a very specific city, the city of Bruges. I think a lot of you Britons know Bruges, I guess. Who's been to Bruges? Yay, cool. Now, I noticed and I learned that a very specific part of the British inhabitants go to Bruges. And I didn't know there was a name for that. So at PHP Northwest last year, I talked to Catherine Reeve and Ian Barber, and they explained there's a term that specifies this. And apparently, most people who visit Bruges are labeled chavs. So apparently these are the people, and I'll never forget. And every time I speak in the UK, this slide will come up. Okay, some formalities. This is my Twitter name, my Twitter handle if you want to follow me. I have joined in, link up there if you want to give me feedback, good or bad, depends on what you want. Just put it up there. And finally, I have a blog, so if you want to read some articles, just go there. Last commercial slide of the day. I work at Combel, we're a hosting company. We do everything from your 99 euros per year till your 99 million euros a year, so to speak. So we do hosting. If you're interested, just check out our website, combel.com. But let's get down to business. So Varnish. Who knows what Varnish is? Who does not know what Varnish is? Yeah, still a couple. Now, let's ask the people in the front row. How would you define Varnish? What's Varnish to you?
Squid that sucks less.
Squid that sucks less. Any other people who have an opinion? You, sir? What's Varnish?
It just caches HTTP requests as well, I understand.
This is basically what it does. People call it a reverse proxy. Other people call it a caching proxy. Other people do load balancing with it. Now, I looked for a specific definition on what it means, and the people at Varnish call it an HTTP accelerator, because it does a variety of stuff. I found a little picture of slow things going fast, and that's exactly what Varnish does. But the main feature we'll be talking about is caching. So, what's caching, for those who don't know? Basically, it's just storing computed data for faster serving of future requests, and in human terms, just putting stuff in boxes for later use. So that's, I think everyone knows that, so let's just skip it. But then the next question is, why would you cache? Why would you do a thing like that? And I think there have been multiple talks about caching. I just went to Rob's talk, and there was a fair amount of caching in it. Bottom line, protect your server. That's the main reason why you want to do caching. Now let's go back in the day when the internet was still young. And in the beginning, there was nothing, as the Bible says. But in the beginning, there was browser cache. And everyone liked or hated browser cache. I used to, when I was like 16 years old, I hated browser cache because I didn't see the latest news. And I had to refresh it, and then I saw the latest bit. Later on, I learned to appreciate it because as a professional now, I see that cache is good and it protects you. And there are different ways of doing it. You have expire headers, you have like cache control headers, just pretty basic stuff. Apparently, and I haven't used it that much, there's a thing like the last modified and the E tag that rather than working with a time to live, work with invalidation. It's a nice feature, but that's not really the point of this talk. I'll talk about Varnish, but from a PHP perspective. Now, if you want to do caching in PHP, basic front-end caching, you'll use a script like this, do it explicitly, use cache control, or you can use Apache. And you have mod expires, that are pretty much the same thing. But these slides are not made to learn you anything, it's just to make a point, and the point I'm trying to make is that browser cache is essentially your friend. But there are problems, a couple of problems. And I think these are the problems, if you come into contact with front-end caching, with browser caching, you probably know those. So there are multiple standards. You have explicit absolute values like the expires header. You have the cache control header, which is relative. And then you have the fact that a lot of browsers don't support both. I tried this when preparing this talk. I tried browser cache, and Firefox did one thing, Google Chrome did something else. You have IE. It's not really that reliable these days. And the fact that people can force the cache to refresh really makes it useless, because if you want to save your servers and people can actually force a refresh, they can attack your backend, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Plus, very important, there's a cache per client, not a global cache. So everyone will probably figure out what I'm going to say next. You should use a caching reverse proxy, such as Varnish. I stole the artwork on their site and used their catchphrase, which is, "It'll make your site fly." And when going through this talk, you'll basically see that Varnish comes with a set of nifty tools and configurations that will really make your site faster. Now, these will come on SlideShare. It has some URLs. Just follow them, check what's going on, and you'll see that there's a fair amount of documentation. I expected more when starting making this talk. I expected more documentation, but it's decent. Okay, let's start with the beginning, setting it up, the basics of it all. Disclaimer, I use Ubuntu/Debian, so the installing will happen from that perspective. So this is also a copy-paste from their side, but it's quite useful. You just add the key for the Debian package, and then you'll see it here. Just get the deb package, add it to your sources list, update it, and install it, and it's done. Who uses Debian or Ubuntu? Okay, so this could be quite useful to you. Now, once you've installed it, you say, okay, let's run it. But it's not that simple. It comes with a configuration file, which resides here. And this is the second time I gave this talk. And I forgot that one the first time around. Start, you have to put it on yes explicitly, because if it's no, you won't have that much fun with Varnish. But this is, no, you won't. It will literally stop working. So put that on yes, and maybe we should consider mentioning this to the Varnish people, that you should have it yes as a default value and no.
I think it could be a Debian thing actually.
I prefer it on.
Yeah,
It took me an hour to figure that one out. Okay, so I'm sorry blaming it on Varnish Ubuntu. So just put it on, please put it on, and then start working. Now these are our basic configuration values. So the -a just tells you, listen on that IP, that port. I didn't mention an IP, so it listens on all IPs on port 80. Now why 80? Because you want to mimic your HTTP server. You want to make your clients believe that you are actually an HTTP server, whereas you're just a proxy. Now the -T, the capital T, is a really fun one. It's and I'll have some slides on that later. It's actually a manageable telnet interface that allows you to log in and do some management tasks. I'll cover the management tasks in a bit. And the -F is the place where your main configuration file resides. Now that could be confusing because this is a configuration file itself. Now this is just the configuration to get Varnish running. To get Varnish working as you want it requires a different configuration file, which is the VCL. And VCL, the extension of that file, stands for Varnish Configuration Language. So there's a programming language that actually allows you to just tweak it. And I think I have a fair amount of slides on that. So for those who want to see real-life VCL, you'll have some. Now the final bit is not configured in the most efficient way. I chose file storage, but it comes with shared memory as well. So in this case, I just took 1 GB of binary storage on file. So once we've done that, you can run it. It's in your etc initd directory. Just start it and it works. But setting up the backend is also essential to getting stuff working. It's not because you have a Varnish that it works as it should. You should mention to the Varnish instance where the backend resides. And the backend, well, if you open this, the etc varnish default.vcl, you'll have some commented out code. If you just delete it all and add this, given the fact that this is actually the place where your Apache resides, then it'll work. Now the trick is I added 8080. By default, Apache runs on port 80, so I explicitly put 8080 there. And you'll see on the next slide that you then have to reconfigure your Apache so it no longer listens or binds to 80, but to 8080. Now this is on production environments. In a development stage, I just switch them and keep Apache default 80, and I just take 8080 if I want to see how it responds when using a Varnish cache. So we've set it up, basically, and now we want to use it. And out of the box, Varnish doesn't do that much. It does two things. First of all, it's a Bezier caching header. So if you've mentioned caching headers, and then we get back to the beginning of the presentation where I showed you how to do it in PHP or with Apache, if it has good caching headers, Varnish will respect it, and you will have the appropriate time to live that is mentioned there. Another thing it does, it stores static files, which is a really good thing. It stores JPEGs, PNGs, JavaScript files, CSS, all other files that don't change a lot. So we've set it up. We know what it does out of the box. Let's have some action. That's what I want to do. Anyone seen that goal a couple of weeks ago? No one? Yeah, great goal, isn't it? So in the action bit, I try to relate to Britain as much as I can. I do have some offensive slides, and I already regret putting them up because we're videotaped, so that could cause some trouble. Now, it's time for action. First thing we'll do is go through the flow. This is a fairly important little drawing there, and it will come back, and you will understand how it works. So let me explain. First of all, your request comes in. It's a basic HTTP request. And Varnish works in that way that it has several stages, steps it iterates through to make a decision on whether or not to cache it or retrieve it from cache or how it delivers it. We call these hooks, and these hooks are programmable. So we have this is a hook, this is one, this, and this. These are basically hooks you can program into. All the rest is just basic state. So you come in with your HTTP request, and you always have the receiving end. And in the receiving end, the system will decide if it's cacheable or not, and if it's cacheable, which hash to apply. So the VCL hash then makes the hash based on the input parameters and looks it up. And if it's in the cache, well, you'll have a hit. If it's not in the cache, obviously, you'll have a miss. If it's not cacheable, you'll hit the fetch one. So the fetch, which is here, immediately. This is the same thing you'll have when you have a miss. So the fetch just basically goes to the backend, gets the data, and delivers it to the deliver method. So, and the deliver method, you'll see some code where I really modified the deliver method. It's just the way how all the HTML and all the data is returned back to the client. So we set it up. We know what it does. We know how the caching basically works. But now we want to learn how it responds. So it's all about success and failure. Translated to this scope, it's hits and misses. So the way to do it is actually have logging and statistics. The more logging and statistics you have, the more you know about your hit-miss ratio, and especially where the hits and the misses came from. So Varnish has a ton of cool binaries that come out of the box. The first one we'll have is the Varnish stat. Now, the URLs, it's not really worthwhile going to them now. So if you go to SlideShare, and I think it'll be added to the joined in, you'll see the link to those, and you can steadily go to those URLs. It specifically mentions what it does, and I'll show you a basic slide. This is, if you run Varnish stat, this is the data you'll get. This is just a summary of how your Varnish is responding. It could be helpful to know some metrics, but we have more specific binaries coming up. So if you want to know how your server is doing, that's the one you want to need. But one of my favorite ones is Varnish log, and it works in a similar way like the Apache log works. It processes all incoming requests, but there's one huge difference. The format in which it stores it is not the same, and the location where it stores it is very much not the same. Like Apache stores it on disk in a certain format, whereas Varnish stores it binary in memory. And if you run Varnish log, it will read it from memory and throw it on your standard out. So you immediately see in a sequential way what goes through your Varnish. Really cool one. But it's not that simple. It's not just running the command, but if you run it, and you'll see a slide of that, it will show you everything. And sometimes you want to know very specific aspects of your hits, your misses, and the things that are incoming. To do that, there are tags that identify all these actions. I have a list of the most frequent ones. You see a pattern there. You see the RX ones and the TX ones, and then you have, like, the first column is some random stuff. Let's go from right to left. So the RX ones are the requests. That's the stuff the client sends to you. The TX ones are the ones that are used to communicate with the backend, in this case the Apache, and all the rest is just random stuff. From the random stuff, I would advise you to look at call, return, and ACL. These are hook into the programmability of it all. It hooks into your VCL file, and it shows you what hits and misses you have. This is a basic use case of it. You just want to know your top post requests, because post requests obviously aren't going to get cached. because it's not really the way it works. If you get a get, it means you just serve a page that you want to display. If you do post, you're interacting with forms, so no reason to cache that. But if you want to know what your top posts are, just use this. And the -c variable just says, please include communication with the client. And the -o just groups them all based on the PID, so the process ID. If you don't mention the -o, it will just go, it's just first come, first served. It just goes in, and it might not be that easy to comprehend. So if you add the -o, it will help you a lot. There are different tricks you can actually use. You have like the RX header, which is all the headers you get, all the HTTP headers you get when connecting from the client to the Varnish. And you can filter out all the user agents. So if you just want to know which user agents are hitting me, well, just type this command, and you'll be just fine. Another one you could do is like say, what are all my misses, and which URLs specifically miss. And then you'll see you can add the -i to filter on a tag and mention the tag explicitly. So we still have tons of other stuff. Like if you want to know how to do, if you want to know all the hits, I had to combine some Linux magic. I haven't found yet if there's a built-in way to filter it out, but this is the easiest way for me to do. So you just say, well, we'll look at the VCL call that happens. So that's one of the hooks. When it hits it, just grab out the RX URL you want, and then you'll immediately see which URL is hit. So that's the basic ratio. Now Varnish log comes with a different set of tools, because I mentioned it's all stored in memory, not in files. And sometimes you want persistence of it all, so you can add the -w parameter. And what it does, the -w accepts an argument, and that argument is just the location where the file is going to be stored. So if you add -w, it's going to store the log. But don't be confused. If you open it, it will not be readable. It's just binary format. But it could be used for other purposes. So if you want to store that scenario, or you have some event that occurred and you want the data on it, well, just do -w, store it, and it's there for later use. And with the -r parameter, you can get it up again and get it fully working. Now let's spend some time going through a basic one. Can anyone read this? People in the back, can you read this properly? Not that good, but I'll iterate through it. So this is an unfiltered version of a Varnish log. This is just a basic request, and I'll help you through it. So this is important. I have a VM on my computer, which is varnish.dev, and it runs on port 8080, which means Apache still serves all HTTP requests by default, but if I mention 8080 explicitly, you'll hit the Varnish. The file I called is test.php, and it's actually a get method. So you see all the C's here. That implies that we're communicating with the client itself. You have your basic RX headers. These are all HTTP headers. And here you see the magic of the hooks. You do a VCL call on the receiving end. So that means you have a receive. But you always have a receive, so that's pretty basic. If you leave out the minus, or if you explicitly mention not to have the C ones, you won't see the receiving bit. Now, unfortunately, I have a pass. So I don't have a hit. It means this page is not cached, and there's a clear reason why it's not cached. If you check it here, it comes with a PHP session ID. This means a cookie, and cookies aren't cached, because if you would cache data with cookies, that would imply that user-specific data would be in your all-round cache. So if I would cache that, the next person would see my data, because it would have my cookie, would refer to my session, and from a security perspective, and from a usability perspective, it's not a good idea. So by default, cookies aren't cached. And PHP sessions are unfortunately stored in that way. But we still have plenty more that comes along. We don't really do that. He makes up a hash. It goes through and it connects to the default backend. So if you don't configure it in a specific way, the backend is always called default. And you can see clearly here that is on the local host, on port 80, and then we continue. There's a second page of this stuff. So if it gets boring, please give me some sort of signal. But I find it quite important that you know how the log works and how you can interpret all the data. So we've reached the TX range, and it says B here. This is all B, which means backend. So this is Varnish talking to my backend, to my Apache. And it gives through the fact that we're using test.php, the host was 8080, etc., etc., etc. So we're just going through it. And then it responds back with all the VCL data. It's very verbose. Not all stuff is clear to me, but you can see going through it how it works. object header, that's just the object that is stored. It's the transport format of the HTTP and the way it communicates back then to the Varnish. So you see all the stuff here. You have the transaction headers, etc., etc., etc. And then we have Varnish top. That was Varnish log. Varnish top is a very similar binary as Varnish log, but it doesn't process it in a transactional way. It just doesn't go through it, first come, first serve. No, it accumulates the data. It compares it and just adds it. I think most people know top, I guess. Do people know top, the Linux top? It's very much the same thing. And in comparison to log, it's even, this is my best friend. If you open it, you give it the right parameters, the right filters, you know everything of the current state of your application. I did that for a customer once. I opened Varnish top, added the misses, and you immediately saw where it hit. I have a slide on that pretty soon. I'll show some filters first. Like if you want to know the top user agents that hit the system, just add this, and it will. The -I says, well, filter out that specific tag, and the header we're filtering on is the RX header, so the receiving header. And you filter out user agents, and you immediately know which are the popular ones: the Firefoxes, the Google Chromes, etc., etc. This is one I used to get the top request methods. It's just, this doesn't really mean anything. It's not like you're going to say, I want to know what the top request methods are. I'm just trying to show you how it works and how you can puzzle with it yourself. There are plenty of options, and the manual is pretty clear on how it works. So if you want your custom filters, it's really, really easy to implement. This is a useful one. Like, what are my top misses? What do I need to improve in some sort? And we'll immediately skip to the layout. Now, this is an unfiltered version, in fact, so it doesn't really filter on any specific tag, any specific URL, anything in specific. What it just says is that it accumulates these ones, so the ones that come along most get on the top. Now, pass is my top one, which is quite bad news because I don't hit my cache. But it doesn't really matter, it's just for templating purposes. But you see how it works. You see that the RX protocol and the TX protocols are the things used most. But if you filter on request URL, you will see all the URLs passing by. And you'll see the ones that hit or miss most, depending on the filter you use. Now this is really, really cool one, because a lot of people use, like, who uses AW stats on his hosting to, not that much. Who uses Google Analytics? Okay, the majority, good choice. We still use, I work at a hosting company, so we still use AW stats because some customers don't have Google Analytics. Now, if you process the logs on your Apache and you have a Varnish in front of it, you won't see that much. It won't represent the actual visitor rate. But Varnish has a sort of tool called Varnish NCSA, and it actually writes all the logs, the binary logs, into a physical file format that is readable by Apache-compliant log file analyzers. There's a link, you'll see it. But this is the most important slide. You'll see that I added the -D capital parameter. It's the demonizing bit, so you can run this in the background. And A and W just mean A as in append, don't write once, overwrite and add it. And -W means store this to a file. You can make it go to standard output and add Gearman to it if you want to, but we'll store it in a physical file. And this is the file you will know. This is the format you're used to. So instead of just getting into the logs at the backend that don't represent anything, you could use those. You can put a log rotate on it, and in the log rotate pre-rotate hook, you can add some AW stats magic, and that will be just fine. One more binary, and then we will have a different sort of action. One more binary, and it's a hugely interesting one. It's called Varnish replay. And Varnish replay is able to replay logs, binary logs, that were made earlier. So this is how it works, and I'll explain a very common use case. So you use Varnish log, you use the -W parameter, and you store all the data into a log file. This is just binary data. And if you do -R in the replay, you can just load the data up, and it will replay that scenario. Now, anyone have a clue why this could be useful?
Interesting.
Yes. Anything else?
Pre-filling the cache?
That's the main one. Pre-filling the cache. Jeroen said pre-filling the cache, and that's an important one. If you're going to have a farm of different Varnish servers, and you add a new one to the load balancing, and you put it live, it's going to immediately attack your backend. So what you want to do is, maybe you want to warm up the cache a bit by having a common scenario. The most common pages that are loaded, you can call these URLs while having your Varnish log command up, and it will all record it in a sort of macro, and you just replay it, and you have a hot cache immediately. So next step, we've installed it, we've configured it, we know what it does, we know how it responds. The next step is manipulating, and it comes with, as I mentioned, a nice little tool called a telnet interface. Now, telnet doesn't seem that secure, but it does something. This is an example how I did it. I just telneted on the port 6082. Now that port could be defined, as you remember earlier, with the -T capital. So if you do that, it will try to connect, and once it's in, it will introduce itself, and it will come with a help and a quit function. These are the basic ones. I won't go through all actions, there are plenty, but I'll go to the most notable ones. It's load, use, discard, list, and show. Now, what does this mean? Normally, if you have a VCL file, and the next bit, I think the next slide is about VCL. VCL is your configuration language and basically says to the Varnish what to cache and what not to cache. But if you have new rules, say you have something new you implemented and you want new caching rules, what are you going to do? You're going to open that VCL file, you're going to change the rules, you're going to save it, and then you have to make sure that these new pieces of data are stored in your Varnish. So you're going to restart the daemon, and you're going to have your new config, but that's not always a good idea, especially in production. If you take one of those caching servers out, the load balancer detects it, it's going to hit the other ones, and if you have few ones, it could cause downtime, and if you only have one of those, people are going to see really strange errors. So what Varnish allows you with the telnet interface is to have a sort of way to dynamically load configurations. Now, VCL load just loads up a file. That's the second argument, as you see. And the first argument is a given name you can give, a sort of way you can identify that configuration. Once you do load, it won't do anything. It will be just stored in the instance with that name, ready for use. And if you do VCL use, it will immediately load it at that time, and you will immediately have that configuration ready, which is quite easy. I spoke to a fair number of people who use Varnish in production, and every time they deploy and they have new changes, this is the way they do it. You can automate it if you can even build it in your deployment strategy that you immediately change those. Drinks are up, I guess. Okay, next one is VCL discard. You can delete configurations. If you have multiple configurations, you'll say, well, I don't really need that one. You can just delete it. And with VCL list, you can have a basic list of what's in there, and your VCL show is going to show you the configuration. So it's actually a good way of testing your configuration without doing it immediately in production, because it comes with a good compiler, because these VCL statements I talked about are actually a sort of pseudo language that gets compiled to C or C++. So if it goes wrong in one of those actions, it will mention it, and the old configuration will still be online, so that's quite a safeguard. And it will also come with a really good interpreter, and it will really say, this is where the error is at that line, at that character, so it's quite forgiving. This is the insulting bit. Are you ready for some more action? I was looking for a glorious English football picture that emphasized the fact that we have more action. Unfortunately, I didn't find any, and I took the last one I could find where England was involved, and this is the result I got up with. So I see everyone's really silent, so you all hate me by now. So let's switch to the next slide as quickly as we can. And it's a familiar slide. You know this one. I've talked about all the stages, and you know when you do VCL call, you saw it in my slides earlier, that it comes with a sort of trajectory it follows. Well, let's go through it, and let's actually do it. This is it. This is your very first VCL script. Something is very familiar about this. It's the naming convention. If I go back to the slide, all those, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, these all match hooks you can use in your scripting. And as a PHP developer, this is not really difficult to understand. The syntax is fairly similar. You have the curly brackets, the semicolons. Even Derek understands it.
Misses the dollar sign.
Yeah, it misses the dollar sign. Maybe we could talk to the guys at LinPro. Maybe they could change that if necessary. But anyway, what does this do? Out of the box I mentioned, Varnish will cache static files. But once you have your cookie up, it won't cache it anymore because it says you have a cookie. This is user-generated data. But you can force this in a very simple way. I think, who understands this? Raise your hand. Who gets this? The majority. It's just that simple. I don't have to do anything. Maybe I should explain because we're only a half an hour in the session. So if I leave everything up to you, won't do a good job and won't be invited again. But what it does, it checks your request, and if it's a get or a head, and the URL matches these sorts of extensions, then you're going to look it up. You look it up in the cache. Otherwise, you're going to pass and go to the backend. Pretty simple, pretty basic. This is the delivery bit, because this is the place where all the data comes back either from the cache or the backend and gets pushed back. Now this is a little trick I use. Who uses Firebug or something similar? Please add this and open your net tab. And once you do that, you can immediately see if it's a hit or a miss. This is quite convenient. I even use that in production, but you can use that mainly for development. If you're not sure if it's a hit or a miss, just add the custom Xcache header and you will directly see what's up. Something else you could do, and I must remind you, all these examples are fairly basic, pretty basic for those who are expecting a very advanced talk. This is not the one. This is for the people who want to get to know Varnish, who don't know Varnish that well, or who have never heard of Varnish. And what you want to do with a thing that caches is just manipulate the TTL. So if you take the bresp.ttl and put it on 10 seconds, and mind you, this is in the fetching bit. This isn't the place where you fetch it from the backend. You just say, well, I'm going to catch it for 10 seconds. You can put minutes up there or other metrics. It's just a basic way of saying, well, I want to cache it for 10 or more seconds. Everyone should have that in there. If you can manipulate it from your code, it's better. If you cannot, please put it in your VCL. If you open your default VCL, you'll see a ton of that stuff and fetches and different examples. Work your way through it. This is just basically proof of concept, but in essence, the VCL has lots of options you can mix and match. Now, I mentioned cookies earlier. You can bypass that if you want to. You can use some trickery. Now, as mentioned, if you have a cookie, that means there is custom data from the user that is not the same for everyone, so you don't cache. But if you put this one up, if you say, if we get a get or a head, no matter what the consequences are, just look it up. And you might serve some data that was meant for some different user, but to avoid that, when you get into the hashing hook, the place where it all gets put together and where the identifier of the cache object is made, you can just add the cookie, because the cookie is just a string. It's data, it's a string. And you can concatenate it to the existing hash, and you will be able to cache those. Thing is, this is a user per user cache, so if you hit it, you'll have your cache. If someone else hits it, he'll have his caching object, so it won't really protect your server, but it will make sure if your site is designed and built in that way that a user generates lots of hits on the same page and it influences your load, you might want to consider those. Now, another thing you could do is just completely drop all cookies. So you see in the receiving bit, you say, well, everything that is a cookie or looks like a cookie, just unset it, delete it. That's in the request base. And if your backend serves codes or serves HTTP and HTML back that has cookies, you can delete them in the fetching stage. So I think by now you clearly know what fetch, what receive means. These are the initial things you have to do. Now, I think before making this talk, I was thinking about the Google Analytics cookies. It was fairly stupid of me thinking about it. I feared that if I removed all cookies, Google Analytics would return false data and people would have, or marketing people would just kill me for destroying their stuff. But that's not really true, because Google Analytics doesn't use the HTTP side of cookies. It just goes to your local cookie storage on your computer and reads it with JavaScript. So even if you would remove all cookies except Google, or if you even would remove Google Analytics cookies from the HTTP request, it will still work because the JavaScript remains the same and it will read your local client configuration. Now this one shows how to remove those. It's just a use case because the thing I want to show off is the regsub all. It comes with a regular expression suite that allows you to do pattern matches and replace stuff. So there's quite a bit of use cases in which that could come in handy. So what we do is there's this UTM bit that comes in all those Google Analytics ones. You all seen the cookies Google created, I guess. Everyone's aware of those. And the fact that they acquired the company and it's still in there. How's the company called again? Everyone know? Urchin, yeah, Urchin. Well, the U really stands for Urchin. It's the Urchin cookies that they still use. Now, we did a lot of caching. We talked about caching, but as mentioned, Varnish is not only a caching proxy, it comes with a different set of features as well. And to shift the attention a bit, I'm going to talk about different stuff Varnish does. It can do a bit of load balancing or content distribution across different hosts. Now, you know my default backend. It's the first thing I showed you when configuring backends, that there is a default backend. But you can define another backend. Now, mind you, this is not something I run in production. Like, I don't connect to server.com. This is just template stuff. Replace it with your own stuff. And the thing I do is I just try to match which hostname you connect to. I think this is a stupid idea, really doing this, but it shows you how you could do it if you want to. If you know that your www site and your other site could be split across two nodes for a very simple way of content distribution or load balancing, you could match it. It reminds me a bit of htaccess and mod rewrite. You can match what the condition is. If it starts with www, well, put it to the one node, and in the other case to the other node. So www example to the left one, and the other one to the right one. It could help, but there are better load balancing strategies than that. You could use HA proxy or things that are brought to you via switches or routers, so there's load balancing in it. But if you don't have the budget for it or the knowledge, you could use Varnish as a load balancer. Now, what happens if your backend dies? That's your worst nightmare, right? You have your Varnish in front of it and your backend dies. Now, as long as your stuff is in the cache, that won't be a problem, because it will serve all the data that's in there. But once the TTL has expired and he goes to the backend again, and he gets a sort of 503 or a 500 error, it's just a basic white page with an error on it, it will cache that, and that is not something you want. Especially when you put the TTL on an hour or a day, you'll have 1 day of internal server error. It's not something you want. So Varnish has something that's called grace mode. And grace mode allows you just to pray and say, please Varnish, or please backend. If you're down, please come back up. I'll serve some old data still, and you can define it. Like if the backend is healthy, so if it responds in a proper way, you can put it on 1 second. So if there's new data, it will take you 1 second to load that data, because it's going to serve old data for 1 second. If it's down, give it 10 seconds. You can put it as high as you want. I've tested it myself, and I just put down my Apache and just kept typing refresh, and I got the data, and after 10 seconds I got a 503 page. There's another way to do this, and that is using probes. So this is very similar to other load balancing techniques. You can add a probe that listens to a specific URL for a specific amount of time with a specific interval, and if it doesn't respond in a good way, it knows the backend is no good. So this is my default backend. It's pretty much the same, except that I have a probe in it. I have a second one that's called other, and it connects to another server, also on port 80, and it has pretty much the same config from a probe point of view. Now the magic happens here in your receiving bit when you count to restarts. Now the restart timer, the value is 0 by default. But we hook into the error stage here. When something goes horribly wrong, you can know what's going wrong. You could say, well, it's a 503 error. And if it's a 503 error, that means your backend is down. And you increase the counter by doing a restart. If the restart is no longer 0, you don't connect to your default backend. You connect to your other backend. Now there's this AND clause that is added. You want to limit the number of restarts, because if you just keep on rotating, your server will go down. It will have too much CPU cycles, it will immediately break. So to avoid that, you put in a limit 4 times. If after 4 times it doesn't work, it just has no clue what to do and just stops working. But that helps you a bit. I have some nice flowchart showing that. So you connect to your default backend, your other backend isn't doing a thing, and suddenly it goes down and the other one takes over. I think that is clear to everyone, I hope. You can combine that with directors, and what directors are is a main way to bundle all your different backends and have a sort of strategy, an automatic strategy for load balancing. This is round robin. It means one request goes to the first one, second to the other one. There's no randomness in it, and it behaves. A director behaves as a backend, so you can just say to your receiving bit, well, my backend is back, and this is the one. And if it's the director or a regular backend, it doesn't really matter. But it allows you to have multiple multiple backends, which is actually good if you work with a large server farm. You can have multiple Apache servers connecting to the same Varnish, and you can have multiple Varnishes linked to load balancing, and you'll have a decent strategy. So this is mainly 50-50 stuff, nothing really special. But there's another one. There's the random one, and you can add weights to it. If you know that one server is a little weaker or is slightly more vulnerable, you want to avoid that much hits to it. So in this case, if you do 1-2, if I know my maths right, that's 3366. If I don't, I'm making a complete fool of myself. And the final bit, before we dive back into the caching, is something I really, really like. Now, what the problem is, if you have like high traffic sites that have a lot of updates, you serve stale data all the time. So what you do is try to have a sort of trade-off between high TTLs but old news, or low TTLs and servers that go down. So it's always tricky to find the selection that works. If you have the selection that works and you don't update that much, in just basic expiration of your TTLs is the best way to do it. But there's a different way called invalidation. So what I've done here, and I really gave away the clue. This is basically the clue. But what I do is, everyone knows the basic HTTP verbs, get, post, etc., etc. I invented, or not I, the people at Varnish showcased it, have a method called purge. And if you call the URL with purge in this example, and you can easily build that into your system via curl or via the PHP implementation of curl, it deletes it. And how does it? It matches it here. If the request is purge, and it's not allowed, don't do anything. But if it's allowed, purge that URL and mention that it is purged. Now, I skip that line. That is more or less authentication. You have an ACL here that defines who can connect to it. And that's really convenient, because if you leave it open to anyone and you're smart and you try to do purges, you can really damage some sites, really bring them down. So that's why we put in security. We have an ACL that says you can only connect if you're from the local host or from IP 1234 or some host name. It's just, my point is to prove that you have different notations in the ACLs. And if it doesn't match, you'll get an error. And if it matches, you'll have a purge. Now, the purge is also something that is in your telnet interface. So if you don't want to code it, but you want to connect via telnet, or you have a procedure that does it, you can telnet to the management interface and do purge URL. And it doesn't really come with a fixed URL you have to mention. It matches patterns. So if you have like the /images you want to flush, well, you just do images and add a wildcard, and it invalidates them. It doesn't invalidate them immediately. It's upon the next hit. It's not like it's going to actively delete the cache. No, the next person that's going to hit it is going to hit the flag bit, and is going to drop the cache, reload it, etc., etc. This was the basic thing. This was my basic talk, but I have one added bonus, which a lot of people like. It's edge side includes. Who knows edge side includes? Hands in the air. Who loves edge side includes? Oh, I like it. I like it. Who has never heard of edge side includes? That's what the picture is for. The picture says you're just going to puzzle your way into your caching. And I'll immediately show your default, your basic page. It has a header, it has a footer, a menu, and a main page. I think 80% of you guys use a similar strategy. To keep it simple, I added basic files. And how does this look like? It's a bit like this. You have your, and sorry for the HTML gurus, I don't use divs, I use tables for the layouts, just to prove a point. You have your header. I'm not a front-end designer. I'm a developer. I'm not even a professional developer. So you have a header, your menu, your main page, and your footer. And the problem you're going to hit if you're going to cache that is if the main page changes with news, you're going to have a problem. And I talked about the invalidation bit with your curl, but that could pose some problems as well. So there are people that say, well, if I cache it, I want my menu to be cached for 10 seconds or 10 minutes, or replace that with the value you want. My header doesn't contain any caching because it has the welcome Thijs or welcome your name there in it, so it must interface with PHP session, so you won't cache it. My main page is only cached for 2 seconds, and my footer for 5 seconds. ESI does that, and I'll show you what ESI looks like. People who remembers SSI from back in the day? A lot of people. And the more I know about ESI, the more I appreciate SSI, whereas in the past I thought it was a stupid thing, like SSI, why would people use that? But it's actually used to render a block in it, and ESI does the very same thing. The ESI standard is very much used by Akamai. Akamai use it in CDN. Varnish only implements a subset of it, but the most essential one, which is including it. So instead of just having your application render all the code into it, you're going to ask your Varnish to load it separately and have its own TTLs. This is done in Varnish. If you don't have a Varnish behind it, you'll just see those tags and they won't do a single thing. Your browser won't understand it. And I heard that Symfony 2 does come with ESI support, so it's a quite nice add-on. But my sole purpose is to show how this works in production. Now, if you do that manually, you'll have to make sure your development process is really made for this. And if you're not behind a Varnish, you'll run into trouble. So I've looked for a little script that does that. I have two scripts. I have a stupid script. This is it. But it does what it needs to do. It checks if your X-Varnish header is set. This is the header your Varnish passes to your backend. If that is set, you know you're behind a Varnish. And what I do, this is two-way communication. I just mentioned back to Varnish, like, yes, I can handle ESI. You can parse these tags as ESI. And then I build a URL. This is pretty plain PHP. I do a ESI include of the URL. And if I don't have, or if I'm not behind a Varnish, if I don't have ESI support, I'll just include the file. Pretty standard. Now, who likes Zend framework in here? Then I'll have something for you. Have a treat. It's my own custom view helper for ESI. Now, I know there are other view helpers out there that do stuff. I've seen someone from Jeroen van Dijk who mimics Varnish. My goal is not to mimic Varnish, but to make sure you have ESI or just your basic processing. Now, I'll give you the clue for this one. If you're behind a Varnish, it will parse ESI. If you're not behind a Varnish, it will render the HTML. But the input I give, and everyone knows view helpers. Who knows view helpers in Zen framework? Yeah, quite a bit. It makes life easy. You can, and I'll go through it first. I'll show you how to use it first. This is how you would use it in your view state. You will just call this ESI, and you say, I'm going to call the index controller and the header action. And if I call this, I want to render either the HTML that comes with it, or I want a URL that points to it, so Varnish could parse it as ESI. But let's go back to the code. So I have this view helper, and this is the main method. This is the ESI method you're going to call in your view helper. You mention your controller, your action, and this is optional. Because ESI is not strictly bound to Varnish. And if I would do this check in the code explicitly, it would only work with Varnish. There are different technologies that support ESI, so I made this optional. It could be either X-Varnish or something else, and this is the header I report back to the server. So this is plain checking. So if the request header is set, well, send a response header and build the ESI. If we're not behind ESI, just dispatch, plain dispatch. And these are some helper methods that do all the checks. It's not really worthwhile, but this is where the magic happens. If you're not behind a Varnish, you want to control the action. You want to go to the controller, dispatch the action, get the HTML. And this is the basic way how it works. I really thought it would be super difficult to do this, but apparently Zend framework is quite easy to understand. So what you do is you create a HTTP request containing your action and your controller. You create an empty response, an HTTP response. You call your front controller, which I initiated earlier. This is it. This is the instance I store in my object. And you ask it to give you the dispatcher who takes care of business. You get the dispatcher. You dispatch, you give your request here, your response there, you get your body, and this is plain HTML. This is rendering it in line, so if you're not behind a Varnish, this will still work. I know this, I tested it. It took me quite a bit of time to develop this. And of course, if you're behind a Varnish and it supports ESI, take the controller, take the action, get your basic router from your front controller, and assemble a URL. Return the ESI tag, and you're all done. Well, all done, you still have to make sure your Varnish understands that. And this is the last piece of VCL I'll show you today. So if we receive a request and its header, well, don't look it up in the cache. We don't want caching on that. It contains session data. It comes across with cookies, so no caching for that. If it's called footer, main, or menu.php, you might want to look it up from cache. And this is where it happens. If it's footer, cache it for 5 seconds. If it's menu, 10 seconds, main, 2 seconds. And here he checks the result header I sent back, and I'm going to see if I can show it to you again. ESI enabled, that's the one you pass. So you say, dear Varnish, I understand ESI, I can handle it. So if you go back here, it will process it. If ESI is enabled, and this is the magic method, do ESI and then immediately unset it. And it will magically work, and this is what the print screen looked like. I used the dates, the current dates, and you see that there are plenty of different dates out there. And this is a really efficient one. Now, this is just a basic talk about it. I think there are plenty of other talks that deal with ESI. I know that Fabien Potentier from Symfony has a talk dedicated to it. It's just to get you started. And if you're interested in ESI, look it up, see what it can do. If you have high traffic sites, it will definitely work. I saw a talk by guys from iBuildings who run the new.nl site. It's one of the biggest traffic sites in Holland, and they used ESI to solve their problems. And I think there are plenty of other customers who do that as well. Any one of you use ESI in production? You're not that happy with it? Almost, okay. Well, that's it for me. I would like to thank you for coming up, and we still have apparently 5 minutes time for questions. This is the tricky bit where you're going to start asking questions.
In the VCL files, can you kind of read from another configuration file? Because I'm a developer. I'm not involved at all in the operational side. And this kind of stuff seems like it's very much geared towards operations. And
I have a different set of talks that are dedicated to it, not really to the fact Varnish or not, but to the fact that developers must be aware of the systems they run on. So I think it requires a shift, a sort of mental shift, that you are aware of the systems you run on, and vice versa. So
yeah, I'm not
really saying.
I'm not really saying that. What I'm more saying is, I'd like to be able to ship a product which has this separation between the different pages, and I can state that there are separate caching requirements, but I don't necessarily want to be involved in tweaking those fine numbers to get exactly the right kind of output from that, because that effectively is the maintenance of a live system, isn't it?
There are two ways. Either you're going to have strict cache management, browser cache management, so the headers you send in your application, if you do that well, it will behave well. If not, you're going to have to cooperate with the sysadmin responsible. So, because we run these, I work at a hosting company, and we tend to tweak it where necessary, but it's just the basic setup. We don't know their URL patterns. We don't know what their application is like. So it really requires strong collaboration between the operational end and the development end, so that's important.
Yeah, I guess what I'm really saying is I'd like the ops guys, who aren't necessarily developers, but are very good at this kind of managing the response times and the cache requirements of individual pages. I want those guys to be able to tweak those settings without having to understand the VCL code.
Well, what you could do is write a scenario. These pages should be cached. These are the URL patterns that respond in this way. And if you could do it in a human way, just write it in a notepad document or so, or email it to the guy. And if you have all the caching strategies inventorized, then it's just a matter of implementing it. I think figuring them out is harder than implementing it. So if you could figure that out for yourself, what should be cached, which patterns, not the explicit pages, but patterns. If you say everything that is /images should be cached, or everything that is /news shouldn't be cached, if you can inventorize those and send it to them, you've done a fairly good job.
But then on that day where you've got something caching for 10 seconds and the guy in ops thinks, actually, you know what, that probably needs to be 15 seconds or it needs to be 5 seconds, they effectively have to open up a VCL file and change what looks like code.
It's kind of code, but you need to work together. I think that's more a human problem than a technical problem.
I guess it can be resolved if you force the caching headers from the server side. So the server side is providing the caching headers by hand. The Varnish knows how long it can be cached.
That's the first point I made. If you have strict
cache
control,
the only rule.
It'll work. Because that was, you remember the slide with the guy praying? That's the only thing Varnish does, it respects headers. And if you don't do it in a correct way, you'll have to play around with the VCL. So if you want to avoid VCL at all time, focus on header control.
I was just going to say that you can also do includes inside your VCL, so you can split out different paths for different, and you can also specify multiple receive and all the different hooks that are mentioned, you can use them in multiple times. So if you have different applications but all sharing the same Varnish instance, you can have multiple definitions.
I usually do the include for if you have a huge VCL file, it's not really that readable, so the include really helps along well for formatting and reading it. So. But also for multiple, if you say you have multiple instances of multiple sites that run, you're going to have good matching from the host names, because not every host, or a host identifies your website, and if it's a different host, you should have a different scenario running.
So I work for the BBC, so everything is under bbc.co.uk, and all the different sites are designated by the URL path. /
and then the first part
refers to the site. Insane things with Varnish, including calling services inside Varnish. So
with inline C?
Yeah.
You should do a talk on that.
I've considered it.
Well, definitely do it. But that's a bit I explicitly didn't mention. Like you can add C code and add custom libraries. It gets really nuts from there. I haven't tried it. I'm not good enough at that. But if someone's good enough, please, do you have a blog where you share these kind of things? I could do it. Share it. I'll have to check. Share it. This is valuable information.
I've got a quick question. I'm currently taking the 4Kitchens PressFlow VCL that they have on there, which I think is a pretty good example of a well-to-do VCL file, and combining that with the edge-side include module available on forward Drupal 6. And they seem to sort of conflict in trying to work around that. But the stuff that you showed on Restart, I've had a good look through the documentation on the Varnish site, and I've only seen the very briefest note on that. Where is that found? Is that from the Varnish website, the stuff on how to do Restart?
I found everything here was either found on blogs or Varnish website. So I had to dig quite deep into the Varnish site, because if you look at it in a superficial way, you won't find that much docs, but if you dig in, there's a fair amount. They have a track site, which has its own wiki, and there you can find tons of stuff. And it links, you only have to go to varnish-cache.org and click the track button, and then you can dig in.
Hello. Yes, it's very interesting, the talk, especially we use the Easy Publish content management system, and Varnish is being promoted to be, the main proxy for that. At the moment, we have a site that is using Nginx as a front end to Apache to serve up binaries very quickly. Is it worth retro-engineering previous sites? Is the performance increase over something like Nginx, worth it, or should we just use Varnish for future sites?
It all depends. There's not one answer to this. We should see the data or see the variables that I don't know right now. But Varnish is pretty decent, but I know that Nginx performs really, really decent as well. It connects with Memcache, etc. So it's really hard to give you solid advice on that with the limited info we have right now. So
okay.
I could talk about it, and we could research it if necessary for you. But it all depends. There's not one solution. People say, well, the story changes every now and then. First it was use Memcache, then people say, well, put the Varnish in front of it. Other people use different technologies. If you have a cache that works for you and you can see the benchmarks show you that the performance is decent, just stick with it, I'd say. Only if you're looking for a way out, something that is... If Varnish would be more flexible to you and would solve the problems you have right now, I would say switch to Varnish. If not, stick to the things you know.
Well, I think it's just because, yes, it's going to be integrated with Easy Publish, so rather than as a bolt-on, it'll be more of a core component, but thanks anyway.
Yeah, we probably have time for one last question, maybe. Yeah, so a big green mic, and then we will wrap it up.
Okay, so other than the purge request header, is there any APIs that we could use to purge the Varnish cache, so any subdirectories or collections of URLs?
Well, you have the telnet one. So you can connect to telnet, but there's no real API that is ready. I've looked into the source code today, and I've noticed that if you're good at C, it's fairly easy to wrap around libvarnish and control this yourself with PHP functions. I'm not that good at C extensions, but I'll have a look at it if I can do that.
You might, if you imagine you're running a blog site and you've got an individual post that an author updates. If you include a header on every page that includes that post, so maybe a blog index page or a search results page, you know that that's got that particular post included. you can tell Varnish to purge everything with that particular header in it. So you don't even need to restrict yourself to purging by URL. You could say, an author's just edited post number 4, let's purge every single page that mentions post 4. So you can do a lot of clever stuff with it.
Well, it comes with pattern matching, so all the patterns you can have. I use the purge URL bit, so you have to mention an aspect of the URL, not the full URL, but something that is mixed in between it.
But you can purge on things that aren't in the URL.
Like headers.
Yep.
There's a purge method. I didn't explicitly use it. I know there's a purge and a purge URL. I specifically focused on purge URL because that was the most common thing to do. But there's plenty of stuff I overheard here to make an advanced Varnish talk. I don't really feel that I should make this one, but there's like the C bit. You should really submit that stuff. Really.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Thijs.